Okay, so we just started recording. Welcome everyone who's listening in on today's episode of Peak. Today we have Gregg Henriques, Dr. Gregg Henriques, as our guest. Um, Gregg is a professor of psychology at James Madison University. He is a teacher, a researcher, and a clinician. He has developed his own theory of everything, in a manner of speaking, regarding psychology and the place and role of the human psyche in the grand scheme of things, essentially. Um, and so I'm pretty sure that questions of transformation and transformative experience are going to be central to Gregg's philosophy and way of thinking about the human condition. So why don't we start by Gregg? Let me invite you to just introduce
Sure.
yourself and what you're about, and maybe tell us, just jump right in and tell us what you
Absolutely.
think human transformative experience is about.
Sure. Well, thanks you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. So I am trained in clinical psychology, in particular, doing psychotherapy. Since 2003, I got here at James Madison. I'm in a doctoral program training people to be psychological doctors. And to be a psychological doctor, it means people come in and they're suffering with some aspect of their biopsychosocial experience. They're trapped in some ways or stuck or experience trauma or failure of fulfillment. And so transformation is a major theme in relationship to what we do. How do people get stuck? What makes them feel that way? How do you get unstuck? And then engage in the process of transformation is really foundational. And indeed, it started me on my journey because I then, as a graduate student, I was socialized and taught about what I would call standard academic empirical psychology, which is basically, hey, there's folk psychology, that's great, but there's a thing called empiricism, and we're going to use empirical methods to delineate the human condition. I thought that was great. I still think it's okay, but I then learned that it was remarkably more flawed than my professors allowed me in on the secret of how weak empirical thinking can be just on its own. That particularly presented itself when I got into the clinic room. And I realized that now I wasn't dealing with theory anymore or abstract behavioral patterns of the aggregate that you can pull out from psychological studies. I had a real person in front of me who was really suffering. And then I had to position myself in a way that enabled them to transform. That means I had questions of values, questions of relationship, questions of models of the human psyche. I then found, a lot of really cool models out there, and I always thought that the best of the best said brilliant things. But I am drawn to coherentism, at least at some level. That means I like things to make sense. So, call me crazy. Then I did orient me on kind of a crazy search back in the 1990s. Not that it was a conscious search, it was just, hey, I really want to make sense out of the world. I got sucked back into psychology. I realized how theoretically insane it was. And then sort of backed my way into a sense-making system that I think does a lot better than current models. And I've been on that journey ever since. So that's a summary of where I'm coming from.
Okay, so there are so many points of entry here that it's not even funny. But maybe why don't we start by having your point of view on what transformation is, how you see transformation, what it amounts to really. And then we can talk about how it fits in with your experiences in clinical practice, your experiences maybe even teaching, and how all that fits into your worldview.
Sure. Well, so there's, we can talk about it in terms of micro and maybe phase shift transitions, okay? So a micro transition basically is a learning experience, okay, where you engage in some accommodation, assimilation, so that all of a sudden you're slightly different in the agent arena relationship that you have. Okay, so if you're learning an instrument, for example, you learn how to play a new song, and then you downloaded some aspects of procedure, and then you're like, oh, I can jam with this a bit, right? You've then been transformed on a skill development. You've moved up a notch. Of course, we have those kinds of experiences all the time. So I would argue and suggest that we're constantly transforming. Now, what we're tracking here in our heart is I believe we sort of are seeking certain kinds of growth potential. Okay, so at least aspects of our heart are tracking our growth potential. And what happens to people is when they're not on a learning developmental growth potential that some aspect of their internal barometer is tracking, they feel really frustrated by that. Okay? Especially if they feel themselves constraining and shrinking into the world. Okay? Meaning that, oh my gosh, I had potential, I had connection, I had growth, and now all of a sudden I'm stuck. Okay? And those are the things that then channel people into, especially when it's accompanied by a fairly salient negative affect, which is not surprising when you're feeling stuck that way. Then you start getting into the transformation that people seek in, say, the realm of psychotherapy. Okay? You know, my friend Zach Stein, who hangs out in some of the circles that I do, has a nice, really powerful, I think, heuristic for thinking about the human psyche. And he divides it up into three big domains. So one is skill development, and that's kind of what I was just talking about in terms of sort of everyday mode of operating, doing in the world, and your talents around that. And of course, this is what we try to do. Most of our education is really focused on, hey, enter into a field and learn skill development. And then me as a professor, I'll give you A's, B's, or C's, and then you can feel accordingly as to whether or not you're gaining mastery. Okay. Then there's ensoulment. So ensoulment for Zach really refers to what we do in psychotherapy. That's the backdrop of your socio-emotional embeddedness and what I might refer to your oral indigenous ways of being in the world. That's your character, your relationships, your feeling, whether your heart feels filled or not. So psychotherapy really is focused on that kind of transformation. Again, in psychotherapy, you can have major macro level phase shifts. Oh my God, empirically, you can document it's called sudden change in therapy. All of a sudden, somebody within 2 or 3 weeks makes a transformative shift out of a depressive episode and into maybe something fairly significant. We can talk about what would be that type of tipping point. And then there's spiritual or transcendent transformation. This is for Zach. So he has skill development, ensoulment, and transcendent spiritual kind of lines of thought. Of course, this may be when you have a transformative experience on with some sort of, say, psychedelic experience or some sort of religious awe experience or some other thing that happens, and all of a sudden your worldview gets transitioned. So if you have a major one of those, then all of a sudden you can change the grip of your sense of your place in the world and how you make meaning along those lines. So if I were going to then think about transformation, perhaps you might use Zach's 3 categories of being and see the kinds of transformations that people tend to make. And certainly my expertise is really in that ensoulment category about how people get stuck in the psychosocial, emotional, character adaptation domains, and then how you might want to help people move towards more adaptive states.
Thank you, Greg, for laying that out. What I'm sort of noticing in what you've said is that transformation can occur at different time scales. So, for example, learning how to tie your shoelaces is on this account an instance of transformation taking place at a very low time scale, or a short time scale rather, and that this is sort of the basis of our procedural know-how of our like embodied interactional ways of relating with the world and engaging in different types of tasks.
Totally.
And so breakdowns at that level could result in different forms of human suffering.
Sure.
Right? And that's one way in which psychotherapy is able to intervene. Mm-hmm. The longer time scales at which breakdowns can happen and transformation can occur. It's the could you remind me of the names of your friend Zach's taxonomy? Yeah, of those 2 levels.
And it's really, I think it's, you know, as he says, it's really a pragmatic taxonomy, not a really, you know, completely crisp analytic one. But one is ensoulment.
Ensoulment, okay.
Ensoulment. So it's really the difference between what somebody like Ken Wilber would talk about in terms of your soul versus your spirit. The second one is transcendence. Okay. And then it's basically how you're going. He argues, and I think very powerfully, that, modern society is way heavy on skill development, and it neglects ensoulment, although certainly the field of psychology and psychotherapy is exploding and trying to fix people and make them happy. And it also is underdeveloped in transcendent. And he argues, I think, quite compellingly, that a whole human experience of being, requires all three of those domains, and that we don't really, in modern society, know how to effectively cultivate them in balance. Okay, so that's his basic argument, and so that would be yes. What you're doing, world alike? Okay, what are you being in terms of your socio-emotional presence, and then relating to the ensoulment of the world? And then what's your transcendent becoming or potential with that which supersedes your ego into the ultimate good, or whatever would be what Paul Tillich concerned your ultimate concern. So then if we then add transformation to that, for me, transformation, and I'd certainly welcome more clarification about exactly where you guys are coming from. It's a very broad word. And basically it reminds me of Michael Mahoney's book, Human Change Processes, which I really recommend. Some unbelievably brilliant tome on change processes across many, many different domains. So transformation, change processes, those would be. And then you can think about, right, micro and macro level changes, okay? And macro would be more of those phase shifts, right? You have a phase shift. So in terms of like cognitive skill development, Piaget identified things like, hey, shifting from pre-operational and concrete, and then all of a sudden phase shift into formal, and all of a sudden it clicks that you can operate at another level, and you get shifted into there. I played a couple of games where I felt that phase. It's like I'm at one level, and then all of a sudden, within like one or two games, like, damn, I can play this game now. So that does. Sometimes you get major phase shifts happening, but you absolutely are correct. You want to think seriously about the time scale and about the nature of that transformation. And my hope fundamentally is that we're in the midst of a macro level phase shift transformation, what I call the fifth joint point in terms of humanity, in terms of waking up and figuring out how to get through where we are, what I call the end of modernity, and what we might wake up to. So now you start thinking about, well, there's a collective phase shift in our cultural consciousness. That's a whole nother, kind of collective domain of that.
Okay, so maybe it might be appropriate right now to take everything you've said about the difference between the micro and macro level transformations, ensoulment, and then the one transcendence, right? That's focused on spirit, not soul, which also comes. I think that comes from Hillman, and that gets rooted back to Jung, right? So that's the lineage there.
Nice line, and that's certainly the line Zach follows. He loves James Hillman's work. Right.
So maybe if we bracket that for now and circle back to it, why don't we spend a little bit of time talking about your philosophy of the world and the fifth joint point, what that really means, and what that sort of what set of basic assumptions and commitments on the ontological and epistemological levels that sort of gathers around itself.
Beautiful. So, yeah. So I don't know if I'll start with just a basic summary of an idea that I had. I was stoned one time in 1997 and popped out of my head, and it changed my life. It was a great example of transcendent transformation in a particular moment that happened at a macro level, and 30 seconds before versus 30 seconds after was a massive phase shift. Changed my life in 1997 and gave rise to the tree of knowledge. I don't know if it would be helpful to share that diagram at all at some level. We can certainly, if it does, you can give me capacity to share screen, and I'll at least bring it up for the viewers.
I'll do that right now, actually, in case you do want to share anything at any point.
Yeah, so perfect. So I'll share it with you just a second. What you're going to see then is a diagram that maps, it's basically is my mapping of the terrain of both. It maps two things. It both maps the ontic, what I call the ontic reality. Okay, ontic reality is just a placeholder of all the shit that exists without our beliefs about it. Okay, and it also then maps the ontic reality onto our scientific knowledge, our scientific ontology, claims about what's real, and scientific epistemology, i.e. the way in which scientific methodology enables us to justify are maps and models of what is real. Okay, and what folks are going to see is what you see is an emergence of four different upside down cones, which are then, I'll describe them as dimensions of existence. So let me pop into that real fast. So this is the tree of knowledge system, okay? And I'll make a comment. Everyone thinks that's the tree of knowledge. That's actually the theory of knowledge tree. And if you zoned in on the first branch on the left-hand side, the first circle, it would be a picture of this thing. So there's a loops of confusion and the little labyrinth of ideas that I developed. I apologize for that, but actually it's fun. It means this thing's like an onion and there's many layers to unfold. So what is this? At one level, if anybody has sort of traveled around naturalistic circles and those naturalistic circles that wonder about things like consilience, which is a term from Edward Wilson about sort of the unity of scientific knowledge, they'll have some familiarity with this because many, many people have articulated a very similar picture. So in some ways, this is a common sense picture. There's a thing called big history. It's a very, very, not very, very, a relatively well-known movement, okay? Naturalist science interdisciplinary movement. And big means we're going to map the whole thing. And history, we're going to go from past all the way back to the beginning. And there is pretty good scientific consensus that there's a beginning of some form in our universe in terms of the Big Bang. And you can see that on the far left-hand side. And this axis right here, time, basically corresponds to the time, the present right here is really the time since the Big Bang, okay? And what's called global time or hypertime. It's the time since Big Bang. And there's been 13.7, 13.8 billion years since the Big Bang, if we take a macro view of the universe, okay? So that's one axis that the big history and the tree of knowledge share. The second axis is this axis up here, this vertical axis, complexity or complexification, okay? And so big history and the tree of knowledge map the universe on the scales of time, from the present back to the Big Bang, okay, and on the scales of complexity, from the most basic elemental pieces of energy and matter, all the way up to the most complex, meaning the systems that have tied together most elements of complexification, okay? And so actually I would argue that anyone that takes a naturalistic view and everyone that's informed by science and thinks that science has something to tell us about the ontology of the world, I would really encourage them to wrestle with this or embrace this at some level. This is sort of, I think these are the basic ontological facts that science has given us for understanding. So I then enter into that space with a little bit more specificity and say, hey, there's frequencies of complexification that we need to attend to really make sense out of, in the tree of knowledge, if you're like a Pink Floyd fan and Dark Side of the Moon, there's the prism and the white light, and Newton's a reference there as well. So the tree of knowledge really functions as a prism to decode the behavioral frequencies in nature on 4 different dimensions, okay? What are these 4 different dimensions? Well, if you pay attention to the graph, you see that actually the first 10 billion years is the evolution. You see an evolution of this dimension of complexity, the dimension of complexity I call matter, okay? So matter has certain meanings in physics, and I embrace those. But on this, it also represents the material dimension of complexity. And for normal size objects, that means non-quantum or macro level galaxies. For normal size objects, we have we can make sense out of the world in the 3 dimensions of space and 1 dimension of time. And the dimension of it here represents the complexification of objects that would go all the way from the base of quantum mechanics. These are the most elementary pieces, and maybe strings, if you're a fan of string theory, go underneath that. But ultimately, sort of quantum mechanics provides a particular realm of the sub-material, and then we can move up the scale and get all the way into what this represents in terms of complexification, the most complex material objects, which really are like proteins and very, very complicated macromolecules, okay? So that's what this dimension represents. This is a picture of human knowledge, and I use the term human knowledge because that's the kind of knowledge we have access to, okay? And it does embrace the idea that there is both reality, there's that which is independent of our perspective, but a theory of knowledge requires the position of the knower, the perspectivalism of the knower, and the tree of knowledge will hold both the real and the knower in relation, okay? I'll come back to that in a second, but basically what you then see here is we're actually looking back. The tree of knowledge is right here. These are the coordinates of the tree of knowledge. It's looking back and it's trailing the evolution of human existence, the cosmic evolution and on our cosmic coordinates. And the next dimension, which happens about 4 billion years ago, sometime between 4 billion years and 700 million years ago, we see the evolution of a whole nother dimension of complexity called life. Okay? Life is defined by 3 different big theories. There are 3 different major theories, and the biological sciences tie them together. One theory, the most basic, is called cell theory. I'm sure you've heard of it. It's the idea that life comes in these packets, fundamental units called cells. Okay? Another frame of understanding life is found in genetics. That's the idea that cells store information in a particular kind of way. That information accumulates, and it's that accumulation of information and the building of proteins that give rise to the metabolic structure of cells. And one of the things that cells do in addition to stay alive is that they also reproduce. And the process by which they reproduce, and they vary and then are selected into the next generation, gives rise to the third basic position from the life sciences, which is Darwin's theory of natural selection and the basic process of evolution across the generations. Okay? So the argument here is that cell theory, genetics, and natural selection provide the ground for biological sciences, and they at least give us an outline for the emergence of the evolution of life. The ontological claim is that life is an information processing and communication system that gives rise to a novel, complex, adaptive plane of existence. Okay, I can talk more about this, but basically the vision logic of it is represented in the tree of knowledge depiction. So it basically says that life is a higher order of complex adaptive behavior, okay, that both exists in some ways inside the material plane, but also above it. So that's kind of paradoxical, but it holds ways of making sense out of it that's also above and within the material dimension. Now, we see here 700 million years ago, all you had was matter and life. But sometime between 700 million years and 5 million years, we see this evolution of this third cone of complexity, that's mind, okay? Mental evolution. It's very important to be aware that the grammar of the term mind, I mean something very specific about that. I mean that corresponds to the dimension of animal complexity, okay? When you think of mind, you think about, oh, hey, my own personal mind and what am I going to do and all that. Well, you're thinking about your human mind, and your unique human mind is different than what I mean here about mind as a third dimension of complexity, okay? This graph should correspond it. You didn't live 5 million years ago, okay? But this is, there's a thing called the Cambrian Explosion. That's when we really see animal life take off. And then you get really complex active bodies. And over a 500 million year period, we see the evolution of things going all the way from worms into insects, into vertebrates, and all the way up. About 5 million years ago, there were a lot of apes running around that were very similar to modern day primates, although of course modern day primates are ancestors of things 5 million years ago. But in terms of their behavioral complexity, they would have exhibited many similar patterns that we see in the great apes today, okay? Then over the last 5 million years, and really, this really accelerates, so I would argue that what we really see in the change of the last 100,000 to 50,000 years is this emergence of this fourth dimension of complexity, okay? Now, we notice with life, we saw the emergence of an information processing system, like DNA, RNA relations that pulled macro level molecules together to give rise to a structure, and then you had cell-cell communication, okay? Mind is very similar in the sense that the nervous system ties cells together and then allows animal bodies to behave as whole units, and then animal-animal communication is very much what this complex active dimension is about, okay? Now, is there anything that happens to the human primate that allows us to tie our minds together as an information processing communication system? Any guesses? Oh my God, of course we talk, right? And we do so, we talk in a totally different way. Animals definitely communicate, but they don't engage in what's called technically symbolic syntactical conversation, or really, which then causes humans to build what I call justification systems. This was actually the first key insight I had in 1996. justification systems basically explains what makes you both a primate on the one hand, and thus very much like our ape ancestors, and at the same time a cultured person on the other, and that makes you very different. Okay, you basically have a cultured person mind on top of your animal primate mind. Somebody like Freud would get that correct. Okay, but the cultural evolution then over the last particular 50,000 years, and then even in modern society over the last 500 years. And ultimately, what you see emerge in the evolution of cultural consciousness is a particular kind of justification system called science. Science then, they invented, what science did was invented a particular kind of epistemology, all right, a way of knowing that allowed for a transcendent realist view. A transcendent realist view means that you can step outside the cultural system of justification and actually generate relatively accurate, although still human knower dependent maps, okay, of the world. And indeed, I argue that the physical sciences do offer a reasonable realist map of material dimension, and the biological sciences in modern day offer a realist map of life, okay? And then the tree of knowledge then says that actually we are confused about the psychological and social sciences and their essence. Psychological sciences should be divided in what's called the basic psychological sciences, which then correspond to the dimension of animal behavior, mind in general. And then there should be the human psychological sciences and the rest of social sciences, which play a particularly unique role in mapping culture and actually feeding back on culture because they're both part of it. Social sciences are actually a different kind of branch of inquiry than the natural sciences. But this says that psychology should break. They should have basic psychological sciences, which is part of the natural sciences, and human psychology, which should be part of the social sciences. It says if you offered that map, we would now have a consilient map of both the ontic reality on the left-hand side and our scientific knowledge of the ontic reality with a consilient arrangement between the major domains of inquiry, scientific domains of inquiry. So that's a summary of what the tree of knowledge maps. I'll stop here. I can bring it up at any time and see if there's any thing that people want to ask clarification about or pull off of there. Then I'll come back to the fifth joint point and transformation, but I don't want to let's take a pause and have a cup of coffee and see where people's thoughts are.
Sounds good. Thanks, Greg. One thing that came to my mind, and as somebody who has been, following your work in this area for a few years, I've cited it in my own work. As far as human transformation goes, my background is also in humanistic psychology, and Gary has a background in that as well. And if we look at Maslow's theory, Abraham Maslow's theory, he talks about self-actualization very largely as what I would consider in your framework occurring at like the pinnacle of that cultural level. And I think there could be some issues with that in terms of accessibility. Maslow estimated that self-actualizing people are no more than 1% of the population, which is kind of nuts if we value self-actualization and we think that it should be maybe a common good, which I think there could be a case for. So I think we would be curious. What do you think about? Do you think that maybe your model could democratize self-actualization and that sort of transformation, perhaps, or at least democratize it in a metaphysical way?
I think that I just finished. I have one more essay to go, or lecture to go. It's called of a series called Self Under Siege by the philosopher Rhetoric. It's a great and it's cynical and bitter. Okay, and it's given at the end of the 20th century. The title of it, Self Under Siege, basically talks about how modern society corrupts the self. Okay, and I believe that. I believe that there's enormous value in modern society, but I also believe that modern society corrupts the self. I've talked to a lot of scholars of indigenous cultures. Okay, the indigenous cultures have a radically different relationship to nature, to each other, to themselves. Now, I am not looking to go back and live on the plains as nomads. Okay, my son not too long ago had appendicitis, and if we were on the plains and nomads, you'd have to roll a dice 50%. Maybe he's going to die if that thing pops. right? Instead, we follow him in modern medicine, cut his thing open, and within a week, he's back to full health. And there's no way that I'm going to trade in our modern knowledge and technology that way. But I believe fundamentally that Maslow's wrong in terms of that. He's right that maybe 1 or 2% of the people reach self-actualization through the network of modern society. But the kinds of peace and ways of being that are available to people, okay, if we had the right framing on socialization, if we had the right wisdom commons, meaning the ways in which we connect to each other, if we had the right relationship with nature, I believe that huge numbers of people, okay, could find their way to being fundamentally at peace and feel in their heart that they have reached whatever potential, God-given potential they may have. And I think there are different potentials for people, but the point of it was whether or not they would feel fulfilled, okay? And that's what you want. You want the system to seek its organismic growth valuing process, shift over to Rogers, but a very common, a complementary humanistic view, and to feel that that soul part of you, that organismic inner valuing process, feel nourished and is on the right trajectory and is in relational harmony with others and one's identity. Boom, you're going to have that feeling, and then people will go as far as they can. I think that the numbers of people that are then corrupted, and I don't mean like in some conspiracy, I just mean the process of socialization that we grant our young and each other, it makes it very, very difficult to find the path. And that's one of my great sorrows as a clinical psychologist. I look around, see an enormous amount of emptiness and alienation and lack of fulfillment. And believe me, if you're in a society where everything's confusing, where you're atomatized, you're chasing off of the empty calories of social reward. Oh my God, I need likes on Facebook, and oh my God, I need the cool next thing, and I need to consume and consume to fill the emptiness inside of me. Well, good luck getting self-actualized. I mean, seriously. So I think he's right that not too many people. I think it has a lot to do with what society is, and I think we actually will have more potential for cultivating genuine, authentic human growth to potential if we get it right and get the right relation. And the tree of knowledge certainly argues very clearly that the Enlightenment handed us a shitty way of making sense out of the human condition. And it's tragic because we have more biological and physical control. So the base of Maslow's Enlightenment takes care of STEM, okay? Takes care of the, hey, look at me, we can gain physical and biological control, but then it ruins belonging and real genuine self-relation because it doesn't know how to pay attention to the human soul in a particular way. That's what the humanists were trying to tell us. So that to me is part of the scientific humanistic philosophy that is the unified theory. It says, hey, there's a lot here to pay attention to.
Definitely.
Greg, could you share your screen again and put the diagram up so that as we're discussing this, we have a visual representation. It'll be easier for us and viewers to follow. I'd just like to share a few things that I've observed and thought about the system that you've laid out here. So in a sense, it's an emergentist model of reality, that there's different levels or layers of complexity that sort of grow on top of each other. And that it's also an evolutionary model insofar as complexity evolves over time. And there's a way of conceptualizing each of the joint points. I'm not sure if this is how you go about it, but it seems like the example that's coming to my mind, actually, I learned this from John Vervaeke. You know, John, you've had lots of conversations with him.
Good, deep. I now consider him a deep and good friend. Yes.
Right. It's the notion of self-organizing criticality, which comes from dynamical and complex systems theory. So essentially, you have, let's say, a pile of sand, okay, and then there's like a sand clock. So sand keeps falling in the same spot in the center, and as it accumulates, right, it builds, and the structure becomes the slope of the hill becomes more and more steep until there's this critical point, this critical threshold that's reached and crossed over, where the final, right, now to blend metaphors, the straw that breaks the camel's back, but then ends up reinforcing it in this case, right? The final sand grain that falls causes an avalanche, and so
Sure.
the sand pile, it becomes greater in circumference and diameter, and then the process of reorganization, right, continues again until the
Sure.
next point of self-organizing criticality. So
Sure.
it seems like, first of all, at each of these joint points between matter and life, between life and mind, between mind and culture, there's a critical point of complexity where there's a point of metastability. There's a lot of entropy, which causes a critical self-organizing criticality to occur. And if successful, then the patterns by which systems are organized or self-organized change in their structural functional organization.
Totally.
And the system essentially settles into a different kind of stability. And once it does that, right, entropy reduces, and then the system, in a sense, starts all over again, but from a different starting point. Okay, so if we sort of take that rough dynamical systems conceptualization of the transformation and of one level of complexity into the other, then self-actualization, if that's something that occurs at the level of culture, at the highest point in this hierarchy, then what are the conditions that sort of promote that kind of metastability and facilitate the transcendence from that level of complexity into a stable state, maybe, of self-actualization?
If I could clarify, Greg, you mentioned modernism a couple of times during this interview, and our listeners, not all of them will be familiar with the idea of what your meta values are. And so I wonder if there's a way that you see the cultivation of values like your meta values. They don't have to be exactly yours, but they could be. How the cultivation of those on a large scale, with this common wisdom, could lead to the sort of cultural movement from modernism, perhaps to postmodernism. Obviously, postmodernism is a fraught area, maybe less so now than it was like a couple of years ago. If anyone watching this is familiar with George's harsh critiques of it, but there is a good sense that Ken Wilber talks about postmodernism, which perhaps you align with, perhaps not, but I think we would be curious to hear what you think linkages are there.
Excellent. Okay, so lots of good stuff there. Yeah, I can riff off of that for a little while. The first thing, let me be clear about in terms of what the tree of knowledge is about. Okay, it's this macro level map of the various frequencies. So when you're looking at culture, okay, what you're looking at there is a representation of the complex adaptive plane of the culture person operating system. Okay, so it's a macro level view of systems of justification and the processes by which they're coordinating human activity. Okay. And so to then impute on there, the highest angle is where an individual self-actualization is a little tricky. Okay. So we wouldn't then just basically, and I wouldn't want to just then draw a line that says, okay, well, that maps and wherever you are, all right, on that line. So like it does represent the fact that right now, the macro level complex state of our systems of justification are at the broadest level because that's where we are in the world in modernity. But it doesn't mean, okay, that this is the healthiest state for individuals. It just means it's a map of complexification, okay? Like, so if I hang with indigenous people, scholars and indigenous people, they look, so what are you saying? You moderns are ahead? I think you guys are like, I've had somebody call me, well, you're a half human, okay? Okay, so your map is wrong, they said. I was like, well, I appreciate that I'm a half human in some regards, okay? But that's actually just not what the map represents, okay? I'm in modernity just like a lot of people but I'm at very different levels of self-actualization than I meet a lot of people in, okay? So there's an individual level, individual difference level versus lens of the unique individual versus the macro level trends. So that's just one thing to be aware of what the diagram is capturing. Okay, each of us is one part in that. And it is the case that each of us has systems of justification. Well, each of us that's a full culture human person has access to language in a particular way. And then we navigate in our relations, just like this podcast. We're obviously navigating our ways of being through the dimension of justification. How else would we? Okay. But there's also all this individual variation. So you have to be clear about whether or not you're dealing. In fact, I complain about this all the time. I'm very sensitive to this because I'm a clinician who deals with individuals in the real world at one level in my hat. And I'm also a psychological scientist that reads all this empirical aggregate stuff, okay? To translate empirical aggregate to the individual is a tricky business. And people get confused about it all the time. And I think our whole field sometimes gets confused, okay? So that's one thing I just want to emphasize, is that the individual real and particular is different than what the picture is depicting. At the same time, the picture does tell us something about all of us, okay? And it gives us an invitation for what our collective experience might be in the 21st century. I'll bring the diagram up again, okay? So if we go back to the diagram, and this was another part of my transformation, within 6 months of building this diagram, okay, the original form of it, I knew that the 21st century was going to be an intense ride, okay? Unless assuming we made it. How did I know that? Okay, at least if I just follow the logic of the diagram, okay? The logic of the diagram says, all right, that if you hook up an information processing and communication system and you get through what Gary was talking about, there will be actually a very important time of complexification in the phase transition, whereby there will be a lot of unstable contingencies that could knock the system off, okay? And we can get into why that will be, but it will be in an unstable phase transition. However, if you navigate the stable phase transition, and then you will open up the novel space that comes with a new information processing communication system, then all of a sudden you will open up a heretofore uncharted domain of complexification, a whole new complex plane of existence, okay? So the issue, what are the ingredients that give rise to a new plane of existence, okay? Well, I highlight that before the Cambrian explosion, what you have were jellyfish, okay? So jellyfish lived before the Cambrian explosion, which would have been right prior to the emergence really of this full mind dimension. Well, what are jellyfish? They have these distributed neural nets, okay? And then what happened around just before the Cambrian explosion is that there was a bilateral animal model design with things like a planarian worm. And what happened was that there were sense detections and motor detections inside the nervous system that were distributed that then got consolidated. And when you got a sensory detection system that got hooked up to the motor system and you got a bilateralization in an animal, all of a sudden that animal gets up and starts moving around, okay, in a radically different way than jellyfish move around, okay? And then all of a sudden that opens up the new mind complex adaptive space, and then you get movement on movement, and animals are operating and communicating with each other, and then boom, you get the explosion of the animal kingdom. Okay. Now let's come up here and look at how things look to me at the end of the 20th century, okay? So all I needed to do is say, well, hey, is there an emergent system, okay, whereby there's a novel information processing system and a novel communication network, all right? It's like, we had transformed our material culture, by the way. Technology is not represented on the tree of knowledge. It's called material culture, and it's the way humans interface with matter and potentially altering life, but generally technology, okay? Which means we transform matter. Now, what we're doing with the digital, okay, is we're opening up a flow of information. We're creating systems of information processing, AKA artificial intelligence, and the internet, which ultimately is going to then give rise to the digital virtual landscape, okay? The point of the digital virtual landscape is that the digital virtual landscape changes everything, okay? It's going to change all of the institutional structures by which we operate. It's going to be as big of a change as it was when we started talking relative to the apes, okay? All right, that's what it says. And so we are then going to be on the cusp, all right, of a massive, if we make it, they're going to be on the cusp of a massive transformation. Okay. So that's what the fifth joint point calling is. The fifth joint point says, listen, guys, the 21st century, as we built the digital, okay, and start to interface with the digital virtual world and control it and feed back on it and then create systems like Neuralink that plugs us all in. I mean, we're on just the tip of the iceberg of this thing. 100 years from now, it's unstable as to what it's going to look like. The acceleration curve on the evolution is just, it's unbelievable. And it's also very precarious too, okay? So because what will happen is there'll be lots of changes without lots of robustness. And if there's lots of changes without robust stability and too many variables happen, you break the bottom and the high stacked thing will fall over. Okay. So we are in the process then, I believe we're right on the cusp of looking out at the horizon of the future of the 21st century. Okay. I believe that the potential, Jordan Peterson talked, about this, Zach Stein and War from Heaven, War in Heaven, great essay following COVID talked about this. Basically, what we are looking at, in my opinion, is we are looking at a massive transition. We have super major dangers of chaos on the one hand, okay, because we're changing so fast and we're changing the relationship with each other and the planet. There's all sorts of potential for chaos. There's also real dangers of order. If somebody gets control of the digital virtual, okay, we see that a little in China potentially, in other places, you get control of this thing, and it's a lifeblood for our communication. You will literally potentially get a 1984 scenario, okay? We're much more vulnerable to 1984, all right, than ever before. So we are having fragmentation chaos, like, oh my God, I mean, just too much opportunity for chaos and too little robustness that then creates too much volatility flux and something major happens and blows the whole system up, okay? So what am I saying? I'm saying that as far as I'm concerned, we're at a very, very important point in history in the cosmos. Our cosmic coordinates are telling us we're in the midst of a phase transition. If we get this right, if we bring wisdom to this, we can create a robust stack from matter to life to mind to culture. We can realign ourselves down all the way through and create the kind of culture that would actually enable large numbers of people to be socialized into self-actualization, okay, and harmonize with each other in the planet and our technology. That's a potential. That's the heaven potential, okay? There's also serious hell potentials of chaos and hell potentials of order. So this is a kairotic moment. So John Vervaeke talks about this as a kairotic. That means now is the time that the decisions and actions we take plays a huge role on the outcome, because the historical outcome that we're looking at is tremendously varied, all the way from hell to heaven. Right? That's why I tell everybody, your life matters now. Everyone's having a meaning crisis, like, just me, this is when it matters the most. Wake up, we got to start moving towards wisdom, or else we'll all go nihilistically hell. We'll build Frankensteins on the one hand and give people control for our lives, or we'll all just go so insane with the digital possibilities and blow ourselves up internally one at a time and commit suicide. I mean, and we see that happening in ways there. So it's a very, very important time. We have to understand our natures. We have to understand what grounds us meta values wise. This gets into what wisdom is when we talk about that. If we meld wisdom with technology and like neuro enlightenment, I saw that, Gary, you sent me that. I was like, oh my God, John saw this back in 2014, and I wish I knew him then, blah, blah, blah. He's talked about in the TED Talk, he talks about wisdom technology. Those are your two ingredients. We need to have good wisdom appropriately. We need knowledge. The tree of knowledge helps with that. Organize, gather wisdom, and then start spreading what I call wisdom energy. And then you spread wisdom energy, you can start the process of alignment. That's the fantasy. And then if we do that, we'll be on the lodestar towards heaven. And I mean that, of course, heaven on earth, rather than any metaphysical point.
Wow, that was very rich and complex, as expected, right? Okay, so I guess we're finding ourselves at a bit of a joint point here, like a phase transition in the discussion. What I'm hearing is that we're at a crossroads, and that this was predicted in some sense by your model, because as every level of complexity complexifies to a certain point, it enters into a point of instability, in a matter of speaking, or maybe metastability is the better way of talking about it.
Yep.
And there's the potential of either complete, pure, utter collapse, or a radical transformation into a different kind of organization that can withstand and inoculate against the kind of entropy or chaos that's being confronted by that system at that point in time.
Brilliant.
So our
Nice
culture is at that point right now, is what you're saying.
Yep.
You made a remark before this about how the modernist worldview inherited from the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution has set us up against right a clean, right, elegant, easy transition to through the next joint point.
Yep.
So I'm wondering what your thoughts are about that, if we can make that connection between our scientific revolution heritage, right?
Yep.
The connection between that and the difficulties we're experiencing now at a cultural level.
Yep.
Another thing, how to tie all that back into our initial questions of transformation at the micro and macro levels.
Sure.
At the individual level, right?
Right.
Not just at the level of skills, right? And skill building and mastery, but also at the level of our grand life narratives that each of us has and enacts, right? And is in some sense governed by.
Yep.
So that's what's on my mind.
Perfect. Yeah,
maybe also Suraj and Gil, if any of you want to like add things to that list, we'll try to get through as much of it as we can.
Right. As I will say, okay, as I tell my doc students, based on history, after 4 years, you'll learn to speak the system adequately. Okay. So, and those are doc students that are really bright. It's a very rich, complicated system that's got many, many flavors to it. So, I can happy to outline, but it's that kind of deal. You don't learn French in a podcast. But yeah, let's take this issue in terms of what did the modernist system do for us, okay, which was in some ways great, and then what was the real corrupting elements that we actually need to transform, okay, evolve out of. So, I mean, without getting into it, the essence of modernity, and is really sort of, it is born in the West and then it becomes global, okay? And by born in the West, I simply mean that there is a particular Greco-Indo-Christian natural philosophy circle that happens. And so that in the 15th and 16th century, coming off of Copernicus into Galileo, into Newton, we get this thing called science, okay? That features prominently on the tree of knowledge, okay? Modern science is a different kind of knowledge system than we've invented before. People certainly kicked around pre-modern science versions, Aristotle, Middle Eastern, Arabic philosophies and things like that, brilliant stuff. But we really did kick on something new, how to understand the world through the modern scientific epistemology. It did allow for a much clearer transcendent realism, to use Roy Bashkov's term, okay? So that was a big deal. And then we fused with it with the philosophy, okay, that comes off of Hume and to Kant, individual reason, the capacity of progress, okay, and the power of reason. And we then fuse democracy and capitalism all to that. Okay, so modernity basically creates this reason, capital, progress machine that's driven, that has a science technology power that we've never seen and released before. And then when it gets released, it turns global, right? And it then tries to generate a particular level of governance and identity, okay? Unbelievably powerful, yes, but also weak in certain regards. Okay, what are the ways in which it's weak? Well, I emphasize what's called the Enlightenment gap, okay? Now, there are ways in which it's weak on the environmental side, weak meaning it's so powerful it turns everything into technology and kills Mother Earth, if you buy that. There are lots of debates about what we're really doing and how dangerous it is, and I'm not an expert. I read lots of intelligent things at multiple levels. I think there's a very good reason to be concerned, but I'm not necessarily an environmental catastrophe kind of person, but I'm not sure. What I am certain about philosophy and science, okay, that's where my expertise is. What I know is that there was a profound, what I call the Enlightenment gap. The Enlightenment gap refers to the failure of Enlightenment philosophy and science to get the right relation of matter and mind. Okay, they did not give us the right grammar to talk about matter relative to mind, and they did not give us the right grammar to understand what science was relative to social knowledge. Okay, so that's the tree of knowledge actually fixes both of those things. It fixes and bridges the Enlightenment gap and tells you the proper relations of what is meant by mind in the naturalistic sense. We can talk about, New Age metaphysics and other spiritual versions of reality. I'm just in the table of natural, just the natural understanding of what we mean by our terms and our understanding of the mechanisms. So there's that. And then what is science relative to society? Okay. What does that mean? It means then the grammar upon which the power of the Enlightenment was very well grounded in STEM and capital labor production. So STEM meaning science, of course now it's called science, right? But they basically mean physical, chemical, and biological sciences. My discipline is, hey, is psychology included in STEM? Well, everybody debates that for very good reason. Okay. And the scientists want it to be, but there's a real reason why it stops at neuroscience. Okay, it's like, yeah, psychology a real science? Well, the good reasons why it feels very different, and that has everything to do with the matter-mind relation. Okay, so we get really good at manipulating matter in biology, but we get unbelievably confused about psychology and the proper ways of being in the world in terms of our human structures, because science then not only does it get imbalance, Ken Wilber talks a lot about this, not only does it give us a material flatland of imbalance, it also is so powerful that the other humanities look lame and weak in comparison, so they get diminished, they're disconnected, and then they're diminished. Okay, it's like, goodness and beauty, you guys have that to the postmodernists, whatever, we're on truth and science is real, and really you're just a bunch of chemicals anyway, right? Like what difference? That's what's real. It's like, oh my God, that's not right, by the way. Okay, this conversation will never reduce to chemicals. And we're four persons here engaged in a conversation, not clusters of atoms. If each of us had took a bullet to the head, we'd still be clusters of atoms, but the conversation would be less stimulating, right? Okay, so the point of it is that we have fundamentally broken our metaphysics about what humans are. Okay, we killed religion. And half of it was good, talk to Sam Harris, but the other half is, oh my God, what actually gives us meaning in the world? Okay, and I believe that there absolutely gives us meaning. So if my family, I'm married into a Jewish family, it makes all the difference in the world, whether we're sitting around Thanksgiving and loving each other and blah blah blah, or whether we're on the goddamn train to Auschwitz. Right? And there could be nothing more meaningful than that. And I'm thankful I'm not on the train to Auschwitz. Okay, so we can live our lives that moves us toward a loving family arrangement and self-actualization, or you can jam an 8-year-old on the train to Auschwitz and be like, oh my God, that is hell, right? And Jordan Peterson is definitely right about that. So modernity does this thing that allows us to then create this machine that gives us physical and biological knowledge and capital labor relations, but it also turns everybody into an instrument. And then the scientific interpretation is around efficiency and effectiveness and measurement and quantification, and it kills quality. I mean, just read Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. It's like, well, what is quality in relation? It's just some humanistic BS, okay? Not to mention the fact that because they didn't understand the relationship between science, power, and society, you get the postmodern critique. Postmodern critique is, well, yeah, but you guys get in control, and then you delineate what it is, and look, it's a bunch of European white men that get dominating control here. Isn't that, how convenient? Okay, so what am I saying? I'm saying that the justification system for reason in science and capital labor industrial relations had its due and had its power. But you try to put everybody under it at a global scale, its unbelievable limitations are going to reveal themselves, and it's going to make us insane, and it's going to make us not manage the system very well. What do we need? We need a transition into a metacultural consciousness, okay? A beyond consciousness. What does that mean? It means that we're going to be trans-rational in certain ways, or post-meta-paradigmatic, okay? When I was in the academy, what everybody was, everyone gets a full professorship, and my mentor, Aaron Beck, most notably, cognitive psychotherapy, that's the right way to go, all right? And I've used reason to delineate this, and this is the proper way to do psychotherapy. Yeah, right. I mean, as if, give me a break, okay? In other words, he's paradigmatic. He latches on to a particular reason-based system of justification and then wanders around as though this is the real thing that generalizes to everybody in Hindu. It's like, no, it just doesn't work that way. So what do we need? We need to realize that we're trapped in our paradigms of justification, okay? And we need a wise perspective that transitions out, allows us to go into these paradigms of justification and out and between them, okay? In other words, the kind of psychological system that is necessary is a trans-post meta-paradigmatic mind, okay? Trans, you go across, post, after the modernist paradigmatic, oh, reason will tell me what the truth is. No, meta, beyond. So you do post meta trans thinking. Now all of a sudden you're in a frame of reference. And ultimately there's a whole movement called Metamodernism, okay, which I loved. I fell in line with this. It's the thing that comes after postmodernism, okay? And the person who I think captures this the best is Lean Rachel Anderson. She has a map called Metamodernity. It's really basically, I think she really distills the key elements. Is very key. She got to this first by studying what's called the Nordic secret. The Nordic secret is how the Nordic cultures, okay, went from bottom of the barrel in Europe in the 19th century, meaning they were poor, they were struggled, they didn't have good identity, they were, and then to some of the happiest and well-functioning societies, okay? How did they do it? Through what's called Bildung, which basically is a very difficult word to find in some ways, but easy in others. It's character education. Bildung means character education, okay? And what we need, what education is, Zach Stein will say this also, he's an education philosopher, psychologist. It's like we need a fundamental, rich socialization process for people to grow into their full human potential, okay? And education fundamentally needs to be restructured toward that. She also then frames metamodernity as follows, which I think is brilliant. She identifies 4 major sensibilities. Steve McIntosh, by the way, from integral theory does something very similar, okay? 4 major sensibilities. Now, she does not put them on a stack and then does second tier or spiral dynamics where everyone creates an ego hierarchy and says, oh, I'm going to climb up the ladder and look down on you losers, which is exactly what we don't want to be doing, okay? What we do want to do is we want to appreciate the wise mindsets that we need to get in this trans post meta paradigmatic mind. So what she says is there are 4 fundamental sensibilities, okay? First, oral indigenous. Oral indigenous sensibility means the grounding and oral ways of relating to the world, like we are relating to each other as persons here in unique and personal ways, and ideally will also impart part of that will be an appreciation back for nature, okay? Because the oral indigenous systems are before the next level, which is the traditional. The traditional is when tradition means traditional or formal civilization. So these are when we get civilized and we build material cultural bubbles in our cities, and then we become national, religious, and have identities, usually in national and religious form, which are actually also very important because they situate our histories, they root us in our cultural heritage, they give us values, they give us wisdom traditions that we should look to, and the wisdom of our elders, civilized elders, okay? So we need the wisdom of our natural elders in the oral indigenous, we need the wisdom of our civilized. Then there's the modernist sensibility. Listen, the modernist sensibility brings a huge amount of power to it and a huge amount of ways of thinking about truth in particular ways that are powerful, and all that's the orange from integral. But we need a modernist sensibility, and we need the postmodern care critique. The postmodern care critique is, oh gosh, look at hey, this comes with social category issues. It's a lot more, it's not nearly as arrogant as it, or at least, I mean, postmodern now can get arrogant, but it's critiquing the arrogance appropriately, and its critical role, postmodern does a lot of good things. So the meta-modern mindset here is transcending specific systems of justification, okay, into sort of a meta position that says, hey, I'm going to cultivate my oral indigenous way of being and appreciate that period of our history and the wisdom it offered. I'm going to appreciate the Bronze and Axial Age traditional systems that came with civilization and wonder about those. I'm going to appreciate science and all those potential perspectives. I'm going to critique it with a postmodern care mentality, but I ain't going to fall into that as if it's truth. Okay, I'm going to hold all those flexibly and adaptively. I believe that if you do that, you know, the mindset for the 21st century starts to really come online.
Greg, this is great. So I would argue that in line with the phenomenologists and my own phenomenological sensibilities, so this is what I'm hearing, that there's a fundamental confusion taking place that seems to be a common denominator in all the criteria that you just listed and in what you've been talking about so far, that's been inherited from the modern worldview, especially from the scientific revolution, that in some sense, here I am and I'm separate from the world, and the world is a kind of pre-given reality, and I relate with it as though it's a pre-given reality, when in fact the world as it appears to me, I play an active, though maybe implicit, role in constituting it as it is. It's a fundamentally relational, right, relationship between myself and the world. The world isn't a pre-given reality. The world has a mind independence to it, right? But it's also actively constituted by how I position myself with respect to it. And to sort of ground this in a clinical example, I mean, one thing we see in many of our clients is that they come in and they're experiencing some sort of problem. You know, they're having negative affect and whatnot, but the problem they're experiencing is framed as people are always mean to me, or I'm always left alone, or there's this like objectification that happens, and a static sort of depiction of these relational properties as being objective properties. And through the work, what we do is we realize, we try to work towards a realization of what is your responsibility here. In what way is people are always mean to me actually being supported by your implicit ways of like relating to people, for example. And it's also kind of like a gestalt problem where right, seeing people as always being mean to me is in some sense me not seeing other possible ways of seeing people and how they're looking at me. And so part of the process is to broaden the scope of perceptual possibilities so that we can relate with a more expansive horizon of possibilities than what we're paying attention to. And in doing that, we learn how to like flex our perceptual and relational muscles, right? Our perspectival muscles, and out of the realization that how we see things depends on how we relate to our own perspective taking with respect to things, which is actually a theme that came up in one of our previous discussions in our last podcast. So, gosh, I'm wondering if, assuming that the world is a pre-given objective reality and having a sort of fixated mindset like that is what hampers human transformation and hampers the movement into higher levels of complexity, like what you're talking about. Which, and maybe one more point to just like throw in there. So when we're talking about culture, right, there's a literature in cognitive science, which also is related to Clifford Geertz's anthropological psychology, right, where culture is seen as, first of all, it's like post-biological in a sense, right? Though it's rooted and springs out of biology. As Geertz describes it, it's an extraneural set of mechanisms for regulating human behavior at the level of groups, which evolved out of the need to preserve our increasing levels of plasticity as we were evolving as humans, right? The more plastic you are, the less you can rely on instincts, which are relatively static mechanisms for regulating your behavior, because now you're confronting a more and more complex environment. And with increasing complexity, you need to adapt the proper mechanisms to cope with that complexity. So that's what culture kind of did for us. So it seems like at the level of culture, we've all bought into a worldview a shared set of basic axiomatic presuppositions as to how things are and what our relationship to reality is, right? That misconstrues our relationship to reality, the relationship between the mind and the world, as one of, I guess, as one of dualism, as one of my mind, myself is fundamentally disembedded. It's severed from reality. It's not playing an active role in constituting reality as it is. And so we've sort of forgotten a basic set of skills that need to be in place for us to become more agentic in the ways in which we relate to the world and to reality, so that we don't consistently fall into biases of the sort that bring people into the therapy room, where, right, their meaning making breaks down at the narrative level, at the micro scales, because somehow they've lost that compass of where is my life going, what is giving me meaning, what is rooting me in a meaningful and fulfilling kind of reality. Nothing really matters. Not even what matters to me matters. That's the point of absurdity that this confusion, I think, reaches. And so I guess bringing it back to the question of how are the micro and macro levels at the individual level connected and related in light of the conversation we've been having about the tree of knowledge. Maybe some thoughts from you, that'd be great. So
yeah, sure. Just take a deep breath and center each of our subjectivities. Right? Okay. Lots of movement going around. Okay. Right. So if you believe that people are always mean to you, you're delusional. And the reason is you're pretty much delusional about lots of things, because we all are. Okay. And it is certainly the case that people are not always mean to you. There's not a person on this earth who's been around who has enough capacity that we could film and be like, oh, there's a nice person. They just walked by that person. They didn't slap them upside the head. See, they weren't always mean. Okay. So here's what happens. What happens to people in the trapping is and John will talk about this, what's called a reciprocal narrowing, okay, of perspective, a confirmatory bias, and I'm a fan of ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy. Okay, I absorb a lot of ACT in my system. They talk a lot about the difference between cognitive flexibility versus inflexibility. We're really at risk of reifying our justification systems. Reifying means to make real. Okay? So once we build a system of justification, like people are always mean to me, okay? Now note, you'll be a particular way and people will sometimes absolutely be mean to you. And then you'll say, see? And unfortunately, what you have there is what's called reciprocal narrowing, a parasite of mind that then engages in a confirmatory bias that then traps your ass in a nasty position. And you do need to come see me, okay? And one of the things that is that we want to help people realize is that is essentially delusional, okay? And what I would like to suggest is that the vast majority of our beliefs are essentially delusional. That's kind of weird, okay? But I'll drop that seed, okay? And there's an enormous, in fact, this is an Eastern, I'll give you some thoughts to think about. So in the Western tradition, we generally have this idea that science is going to figure out what the objective reality is, and it exists independent of what we think, although quantum mechanics, general relativity said, yeah, maybe not. But anyway, that was the idea, right? That force equals mass times acceleration, doesn't matter what you say. And there's some truth to that, okay? But it is very important to note, folks, that many philosophical traditions with a lot of depth have pointed out the fallacy of this at multiple levels, okay? There is no way that there is a physical theory of everything, like as in this conversation. And it doesn't matter if they unify quantum mechanics and general relativity, okay? That doesn't make it of everything. That makes we're going to try to unify the fundamental basis of physics. It doesn't mean anything about the fight you just had with your wife. Sorry, okay? So it's not everything by any stretch. And anybody that tells you that is delusional, as far as I'm concerned, in a huge way, okay? So in terms of your own subjective, I can basically, science doesn't give a shit about your subjective experience. It's a complete error, okay? Your unique reality is error to science. It doesn't have anything to say. It's completely blind to your subjective idiographic experience of being. That's the nature of its language, okay? Everything that you experience from a scientific perspective is unreliable, subjective, unpredictable, and error, okay? So anyone that would use science to say, oh, now I'm going to use science to interpret my experience and to say certain things is just speaking gibberish. You've equivocated across a wide variety of different domains, okay? What is real, and the Eastern people get this right. You know, the Eastern traditions called what's behind your eyes the absolute, okay? And they call the scientific theory the relative, okay? Because it's a theory about reality as opposed to the absolute reality of being from the first person experience. And they're right about that, by the way, okay? There is nothing more real to your subjectivity than the experience of isness, to use my friend Rob Scott's term, okay? The experience of isness simply is dropped into the screen of your perspectival knowing, okay? There's no inference that you have. You just open your eyes and you see, I see a hand in front of me, okay? What Descartes should have said when he said, I think, therefore I am, he should have just said, I feel. That's what he should have said, okay? The fundamental conclusion of where you get a collapse between epistemology, meaning how you know, the ontic experience of reality, which is sort of like, okay, and your ontology is in your experience of being. That collapses, okay? And it simply is the case that I'm experiencing my hand right now. Whether I have a hand out here or not, you can debate, okay? But there is a very profound reality. And the way you ultimately relate to that reality, you are a strange causal loop. So what you say about it is what it becomes and vice versa, okay? You construct your own subjective reality. So the power that is good news and bad news. The good news is you have an enormous power, okay? And so that's the good news, all right? The bad news is that because you have enormous power and because our society is corrupt and it's the way in which it can lead you to delusion, is that huge numbers of people are trapped inside their head in little prisons of what another of my friend called emotional warfare, internal emotional warfare, and they kill themselves sometimes. I mean, that's how bad it is, okay? And that's what's tragic. But it's all in your head a lot, okay? And I don't mean that, you know, that's not like there's not a relative reality out here,
right.
But it's very important to know, and we really need to teach people, okay? And in fact, I'm still learning how to connect to my experience of being in a full self-actualized, mature way. I think it's going to be an ongoing journey, but I can tell you I've learned how to do that over the years in a way that's a lot fulfilling and healthy and centered and coherent and integrative than I used to be, that's for sure.
That's really nice.
Yeah.
Go
Greg,
ahead.
there was something I wanted to seize on in there, and it's your modification of Descartes. I feel, not I think, therefore I am. Descartes' cogito has come under fire quite a bit, especially by, you know, maybe postmodernists in particular, that I've seen in the last few years. And I'm nowhere near as experienced in the academics as someone like you is, but I wonder if there's a way. I think a lot about this as somebody in the field of psychology. I'm often worried by the degree to which we in the West, we privilege thought over feeling, where as a psychologist, I'm torn between, on one hand, thinking that logic evolves in a sense from this kind of maybe primitive emotionality, but on the other hand, in terms of living my life, I find it almost all the time, I find it wise to balance the emotion and the logic. And so what I wonder is, have we committed some grave error across the centuries by privileging the thought, maybe because it's more comfortable to us, maybe because we think we can achieve some certainty, that maybe it's a delusion that we can achieve some conviction with it. And right. I think we need the feeling there to really balance things out and transform in the right way. Yeah,
it's just one of the corruptions of modernity, 100%. Ian McGilchrist does a nice job in articulating this, and so does John Vervaeke. So John Vervaeke and his 4 P's of knowing. Okay? The 4 P's of knowing are procedural, that is how you tie your shoe after you learn, then it becomes automatic. That's one kind of knowing. There is perspectival, the inside, which is basically the fusion, by the way, although we have access to perception, there's also, it's the fusion of what you see relative to the interior and then your affective valence of it. That's all gets gestalted in your perspectival knowing. And the affective valence then charges your participatory knowing at the fundamental level about where you're going to move toward. Hey, this is great. Or move away, this sucks. Okay. And that's your embodied valence that then directs your participation. All right. So procedural, perspectival, participatory. I haven't said a word about reason. Okay. All right. We're primates. All right. And we got a lot of millions of years of primate evolution on us. Thank God for it. Okay. All right. Propositional comes last. And although as powerful as it is in some ways, it's unbelievably corrupt. Go and study John Watson. Okay. You want to know how corrupt it is? Study John Watson, who then thinks, based on his theory of analysis, and his actually is just confused, he gets epistemology and ontology confused. Okay. Epistemology is what you can see. I can't see your first person experience. All right. Ontology is what I claim to be. Because you can't study science from a first person perspective, okay, and because he adopts the matter in motion, he decides that all you are is a collection of neural reflexes. Okay. And then his brilliance is, well, okay, I'm going to raise infants. And he does this with his kids. That's why 2 of them end up killing themselves. If I have to go back and check that don't hold me that. I know he had a horrible relationship with his entire family because he treated them absurdly. Okay. Now just ask any indigenous mother how to treat your kids. Okay. You know, the wisdom of the primate. I mean, it's just not even close to some man coming along with some propositional knowledge and telling you what's right based on the authority of science. It's insane. Okay. And we've completely done that. That's why we're soulless. Why do you think we have more material control and more misery? Because of the insanity of propositional knowing. And we didn't even understand what propositional knowing was. That's the whole point of the justification systems theory is really, oh, it's a post hoc rationalizer, okay, that is managing the Freudian relationship between level 1 subconscious into your unconscious. And then it seeks power in a particular kind of way. And then it legitimizes them when it latches onto that, it gives you particular narratives that's confirming. All right. It's like, yeah, no, that's not the authority. It's pretty good at doing physics and building a periodic table. It's not good at raising children. Okay, I mean, finally, we're getting around to it, you know. But I mean, hell, when John Bowlby came along, it's like, hey, you know, if you don't hold these kids, they get this insecure attachment, they seem really screwed up. The analysts were like, well, that's just because of the fantasy inside. No, it's hold the children. Get together and love one another. It's really not that complicated, but people will be 10 times better off. And we've known this forever, you know, we've known in our hearts. So we've corrupted our understanding. We have completely tried to gain control over nature. Many of our justification systems validate our superiority rather than our embeddedness, and they have alienated our primate heart. And that's one of our massive sicknesses, okay? If you listen to the heart and realize that actually it seeks being known and valued, that's what your heart seeks in a relational world, okay? It's called relational value. You want to be known and valued by important others, all right? That's what you want. Okay, and I can show you 6 million examples of this. All right, and it's right. You get that belonging and esteem needs from a Maslowian perspective. So what does that mean? We should create a society that cultivates being known and valued. What do we actually do capitally? We created an instrumental society where we basically judged you and then we gave you money if you behaved in accordance with the powers that be. So you then had to sell your fucking soul. So you go out and work to get money, and then you'd feel completely alienated. And so the whole point of it is that there's a complete misconnection between our heart. And so I can't emphasize enough how much the system corrupted the potential of head to heart into relational world harmony. The humanists do get this right. Of all of this quasi-scientist people, the humanists, that's why I'm a scientific humanistic theorist. They're brilliant in that regard. And they're trying to correct some of the unbelievable errors of the behaviorists and analytic people, at least in the 1950s. You were going to say something, Gary, sorry.
Yeah, no worries. I was just going to add that the basic assumption that seems to be presupposed in these kinds of interactions is that my subjective experience is somehow untrustworthy. And so we've developed a cultural grammar and a language around objectivity, right? And making things as bias-free and unsubjective as possible. And in virtue of that, because of that, we've failed to develop a sophisticated language around experience itself, around subjectivity. And so one of the other things that I notice in the clinical world is that people through psychotherapy, when it goes, so to speak, well, they get to realize what their position and value in their world is. And there's a lot of self-doubt that ends up being like reduced as a result, and a regained sense of confidence that they gain from that process. And so maybe, as we start wrapping up now, one thing to think about is maybe what's necessary for reliable human transformation as a kind of process that you can stay engaged with, right, is the cultivation of a certain kind of language around your experience that isn't haunted by pervasive feelings of self-doubt, right, of critical chatter, negative self-chatter, and one that creates space and invites feelings of validation towards one's own self. And the problem there, of course, is that, and maybe this is what turns this not into an epistemological issue, but actually an existential issue, that when you're engaged in confrontations with others, and what's on the line here is either my point of view or your point of view, then if I'm too confident and if I happen to be wrong, then I'm being an asshole in some sense. Then I'm in some sense unfairly stifling over your perspective, right? And invalidating you. But if I'm too meek, then I don't give myself enough credit. So part of what factors into this is individual differences in maybe like extroversion and agreeableness, right? And how ready and willing I am, and how I'm predisposed to solving the problem of balancing my needs with others' needs, self-validation versus other validation.
Absolutely.
And finding that fine line between, right, validating my own perspective and not invalidating yours is something to be discovered through exploration and experimentation, a cognitively open and flexible attitude, a receptivity to the unknown, which of course we also see that there's a lot of fear that comes with this, with this process, because of that restricted agent arena relationship, the narrowing, the reciprocal narrowing that you were talking about, the possibility of doing something other than what you're used to doing, right? Which is this narrow way of either I'm always invalidating my own perspective, I'm always self-doubtful, or I'm always doubting and invalidating you, right? The possibility of doing something other than that because I haven't made contact with it becomes inherently threatening. And so part of what psychotherapeutic work ends up being about is providing somebody with enough security, with a kind of supervision, right? To validate the process of confronting that possibility, of exposing themselves to that possibility, to see that mere exposure to that possibility does not result in catastrophe. And that's what you learn, that you can do something that you're not used to doing and still be okay. And maybe by doing that, getting over your fear of doing that, you get to learn to be differently. Get to learn to be in a way that feels more balanced, more optimized, more appropriate. And in engaging in that process, you realize that the problem wasn't that, right, others are always mean to you or you're always mean to others, for example. The problem was that you were foreclosing a certain possibility, that exposing yourself to that possibility was necessary for gaining access to a wider spectrum of states that you can inhabit in order to relate with things more appropriately. So ultimately, maybe tying, at least as it's being tied together in my mind, everything that we've been talking about is that we've inherited a language from the Enlightenment, informed and shaped by the scientific revolution, that sets mind and world apart from each other as opposites. And the language that we've developed that's reached a very high level of sophistication has been organized around the language of the objective world. And our understanding, therefore, of our own subjectivity and its place in the objective world has become impoverished because of this
Yep.
malnourishment
Yeah.
over the centuries, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll
Yeah.
pick up on that and see. I'll give you a couple more just things, and we can always circle back. So there are two things that I'll give to sort of tie this in. One is a classification of different modes of justification. Okay. Then I'll come back and talk a little bit about the 8th branch on the tree, the little black dot back there, called COM-MO. Okay. So you guys can, which is an integrated approach to psychological mindfulness. And then you could start to, and then these are the kinds of things that we need to be growing into. Okay. So first, in terms of, if you go back to the old Greek classification of rhetoric, okay, rhetoric there are really 4 different, although it depends on how you look at it, but there are 4 really interesting domains of rhetoric. Okay, one is the logos, one is pathos, one is mythos, and the other is ethos. Okay, all right. So what I'm going to argue is that there are good reasons. Rhetoric is another way to think about justification. Okay, rhetoric and justification. Actually, the word justification, it goes everywhere when it comes to propositions. It's a beautiful word, a slippery word, but I use it. I know what I mean by it, and But here we can use it in terms of sort of thinking about logos systems of justification, pathos, mythos, and ethos. Okay, and what you are talking about, Gary, is that science is very much aligned with logos, and logos meaning sort of logic and light of day, and the capacity to develop a correspondent theory of truth that says this is true or it's not, and we can analyze it and come to some objective conclusion. Okay, and that's a very important epistemology. We need that. Okay, but that's not the only way we need. And in fact, going back to other points that we've made, is if we do, we're going to be very, very impoverished. Okay, because there's also mythos. Okay, mythos is our collective story. Okay, it's the embodied story of being, which is then going to infuse what is with our collective sense of what ought to be. Okay, and remember, science, especially basic science, sucks and is essentially completely impotent on saying what ought to be. Okay, it just says what is, describes, explains what is. But we obviously are embodied individuals that have that heaven and hell before us. So I want to move toward heaven. I don't want to go back to Auschwitz. Right? Okay. So, okay, the myth is sort of, okay, why do you think the thing is a garden in a tree? All right, as scientific as I am, I want to recognize what are archetypal myths of trees and gardens. Okay. And what do they say about how we are in the world as a collective? What is our histories and all of that? Okay, so the mythos is what is our collective justificatory narrative of what might or ought to be in the world, our values, okay, and the storied ways we position ourselves. It's a totally different justification. And then finally, the pathos pertains to suffering or emotion. Okay, that means that each of us are primates that sit on a subjective experience of being in the world. Okay, and have our own particular where does our mind come from? It comes from this perspectival push, and all of a sudden when things appear to us, right, and they feel a certain way, that pathic relation is the narrator back into the heart. Okay, and we are lousy in our society in helping people those domains. Ideally, the unified theory says those domains should be in conciliant harmony. They're totally separate, don't get me wrong, because they're totally different epistemologies. They have different tasks, but they should be in proper balanced relation, okay? And they should be tied to an ultimate wisdom ethic, grounded valued states of being, okay? So a macro level, post-metamodern trans kind of justification would be able to house those and be in proper relation depending on what the question is, okay? Now, because we've done so bad about the pathic, we haven't taught people how to relate to them. In fact, what we tend to see, because we medicalize it, oh, you're feeling negative, so that's bad. So now take a pill. I mean, that's like the dumbest thing. In negative feelings are not bad. Okay, that's not what that negative means. It just means valence. Thank God for your negative feelings. Okay, they tell you things. They do things for you. Okay, so the fundamental question is, how do you properly relate? What's the proper relation to the pathic? In this case, by which I mean your core emotional self. You want to hold it in the proper sweet spot. The sweet spot is that you want to be aware and attuned to it on the one hand, okay? Aware and attuned to it, and you want to adaptively regulate it on the other. Because these are your primate emotions. If you hang out in the animal world, you see animals react pretty quick, right? They can get pissed, they can get sexual, they can get flee, and we humans actually have to regulate a lot. So it is not good to act on every emotional impulse you have. Clearly, you got to channel them through your person side. But they tell you super important things about what's going on, what's important, and how to be oriented to the world. So you are tuned and aware, and then you adaptively regulate, okay? What many people do is they rationalize, I don't want to feel this way, stop making me feel this way, which means you're trying to control. And then they build, and then they trigger, and then you're flood, and then you act as all of them, and then you hate them even more because you embarrass the crap out of yourself and go running out of the room, and you get a 3-day depressive crash, and then you have more shit on top of you. Like, I hate these feelings. Okay. So what do we want? We want to teach individuals how to hold the pathic space accordingly. Calm MO. Okay. MO means that you develop a metacognitive observer. It also doubles as modus operandi, okay? Which is like, means it actually has something to practice. It's the place of the internal sage. Vervaeke talks about the internal sage. You want to cultivate the internal sage of a metacognitive observer. And the first thing it says is be calm, and you want calm body, calm emotion, calm spirit. Basically, that's what I would say you want to be, rather than polyvagal defensive activation. Get calm, get back to breath. Okay? Then what? It's an acronym, okay, that says, from a metacognitive sense, be curious. C stands for curiosity. Don't be closed and rejecting, be curious and open to what this is. So you're going to be aware and attuned. You better be curious about what it's telling you. Okay. The A in calm stands for acceptance. This is, we got a distress tolerance. Don't resist suffering. Okay. Pain comes, actually, suffering is a function of both pain times resistance. Acceptance, let go of the resistance. Life does sometimes suck. You are a miserable little primate that's going to die. Yep, that's true. Okay, get used to it. If you get used to it, actually, the world gets a lot better. L stands for loving compassion towards self and others, cultivating an attitude of loving compassion. And then finally, M is motivated toward valued states of being in the short and long term. So given that, what do I want to do for the outcomes in this specific situation? And who do I want to be next week, next year, and ultimately by the time I die? Okay, so it's very much like ACT, but basically it's a combination really of ACT and interpersonal neurobiology from Dan Siegel. And it then incorporates a lot of the wisdom traditions, and it actually grows. So it actually just basically is a set of principles and processes about how to arrange that pathic subjective relation. And it's also somewhat of a critique against the current system that says, gosh, there's a lot of simple stuff that we do a lousy job teaching people about.
Greg, maybe to tie it all together on a very personal note, let me, this is, I guess, a ritual that we've already picked up throughout our podcast so far. The question I want to pose to you, and you could tie in whatever you've said so far into the answer, but if you had a chance to travel back in time and to speak with your earlier self, what is it that you would communicate to yourself that you find would have been important to know in the transformative sense, I suppose, but maybe just to keep it open, what important things would you communicate to your earlier self if you had the chance?
Right. It's okay. Basically, So what do I mean? I'll give you a little more meat on that. So this journey that I'm on, it's a unique journey, and it's weird. Okay, you test it out. You go tell other people that you think you discovered a unified theory of all human knowledge. Okay, and then everybody says that you don't, is an idiot. Guess what's going to happen? You're the goddamn quack right away. Okay. Okay. So it's been a weird journey in relationship to that process, right? Okay. I mean, it has. Okay. So my ego, who am I in relationship to that, is a bizarre thing. I am, I certainly have moments in which I'm like, okay, yeah, I don't need to get into my neurotic chapters. Okay, they were there. Okay, I could have done worse. I've seen worse. All right. So I'm not being hard on myself. But I had my needing to please my fathers for quite some time. My real father, who's a professor, and God love him, I'm very close to him, but he also has a classic modernity version of reality on the world, as well as many of my academic fathers. Okay. And for many years, it was an internal struggle, which I'm really glad I followed my heart. I knew, in fact, I didn't really have much choice, I will say. My body and all of my charge was like, go in this direction. But my ego head was sort of like, what is wrong with other people not seeing it? And am I a narcissistic bastard who insists on this to compensate for underlying felt sense of insecurity? I don't know. It's just damn confusing. And at times drives me crazy. Okay. So my 50-year-old self can look back on my 25 to 35-year-old self and say, it's okay. These things take time. You have followed your heart. That's good. You're onto something. Let it go. And in fact, in retrospect, I'm glad that I went for as long as I did by myself. In some ways, it allowed me to find a number of powerful nuggets that are actually very hard to do when you're with other people. There is something to be said for on your own journey. And I would say to everybody, I've come and gotten from. I have a real believer in the unified theory, but also a powerful life coach who orients me, in terms of learning an even deeper relationship with my pathic self. Okay? And in fact, I've talked recently, I encountered that I had a slight phase shift in the last 2 months or so. And you'll hear me sometimes talk on podcasts about wisdom energy. Okay. I actually had a phase transition where I dropped into wisdom energy, where I let go of my ego. Okay, completely, because I know about ego diffusion, but I'm also justificatory. That's where a lot of energy goes. Let go, okay, and have made full contact with gross consciousness. I've done this in transcendent states before, but I now have gross contact with my gross consciousness, where I can drop and love being without memory or desire. Okay, so that's all of a sudden you get the I feel, love, being, and then yesterday, 3 minutes ago, my next podcast all of a sudden is gone. And you're there. Okay. So I would have given myself, you have to learn how to do this, and you have to go through a lot of development. I would have given myself some inclination that it's okay to be, and stop thinking about the future and why you're not getting more attention and your own ego. Let go of some of that and be and love it for being. That's what I would say.
Very beautiful. When you're doubting yourself, maybe you could try to trust yourself a little more. And maybe if you do it, then it'll take you somewhere very worthwhile. And I feel like that's kind of the depiction that you shared. You're finding yourself in a place that seems like justifies very much so the suffering that you've had to go through, the pathos, in order to get there. And you did it by developing your own language of subjectivity, ways of validating your own experience and your own sense of self and your own sense of curiosity and wonder and meaning. And in pursuing that, I really like that message. Thanks for
it's been a transformational journey. So and I appreciate your guys' inquiries into that. Those are beautiful things.
Serge, did you want to add something before we wrap up?
No, one thing I guess I could say is on a more epistemological note, the idea of emergence for a little while was driving me crazy, and I say this as somebody who has like a background in complexity science, and what I kind of realize is I think if I accept that emergence is just a miracle of nature or of reality, I don't need to like peer too closely into the mechanics of that emergence. It just happens. It just is. I think for me that was kind of a powerful lesson. That some things maybe you could explain it, maybe it just you can't explain it yet. Maybe there are explanations I don't even know about, but I would look back at myself for that year or so and say it's all right. It's not something to go crazy over. So I in that weird way, maybe I understand where you're coming from, and just accepting the level of progress or the level of understanding that I was at. So thank you.
Amen. And we could have a whole nother conversation about emergence, but
Yeah,
for right now, we'll just resonate with each other's subjectivities.
sounds perfect to me.
Thank you so much, everyone, for bringing your curious and kind and loving presences to this discussion. We went on a whole roller coaster ride of historical, theoretical, philosophical psychology, theories of everything and nothing or something, and also brought our feelings into it. So thanks for joining us, Gregg. And for our viewers,
Thanks for having
please check out Gregg's YouTube channel on the theory of knowledge. I think that's the only one, right? Well, we'll talk about this and I'll include all the links.
I'll put you, if you can put them up, I'll give you the links to go to my stuff.
Okay, so in other words, check out the description. The links will be included there. You could check out Gregg's work. You can keep up with his developments on the theory of knowledge. If you want to learn more about some of what we've talked about today, you can go there. So thanks for joining us on Peak, and stay tuned.
Fantastic. Thanks for having me.